Welcome. My name is Robert Boynton. I'm the director of the Literary Reportage concentration here at New York University. And I'm very happy to welcome you to a discussion between our own Ted Conover and our own Robert Moor. Rob is the author of On Trails, an Exploration, an Examination. What is it? An Exploration. I was right. An Exploration. And we're really proud. Rob, as you may know, developed the seed of this book, this project, while he was here as a student in the Literary Reportage program. He is the first of a number of students who have gotten book contracts from here, and some are in the audience, and we're very proud to have them, very proud to have Rob. I wanted to there's one anecdote I want to tell you about when when he was first applying for the program. He was through hiking the Appalachian Trail, and I was trying to get a conversation with him. I wanted to talk to him about what he'd been doing, and he would call me from these stops, and we'd have to arrange these different telephone conversations. And he even, it was a phone conversation, but I could tell he seemed wet and tired, and that kind of thing. He had that affect. And then when Rob came here, it was the fall of 2008, and Rob showed up, and we were talking about his plans for his time here, and he said, in his very, very serious-minded way, he said, I've got it all figured out. He'd wanted to write a book about through hiking the Appalachian Trail, which I thought was a good idea, and certainly a germ of a very good idea. And he said, well, I've got it all figured out. There are 9 courses, and each course is going to be a chapter of my book. That'll be the final project for the chapter of my book. And then that way, by the end of 3 semesters, I'll have essentially the book. And then I can do some rewrites on it later on like that. And I was so incredibly impressed by his certitude and but it was totally ingenuous. That's why there was no hubris. It was just sort of like, this is my plan. This is what I'm going to do. And I just thought, okay. And I said, well, life doesn't really work that way. I don't think books really work that way, but whatever. And we figured out a way. And he made his way through and did some terrific pieces for all of his different classes and his final project, which eventually became this book. And I'm really just delighted to welcome him back, and congratulations on the book.
Nice to see some faces from back in the day tonight, and fun to be here with Rob to talk about this completed work, which, as the other Rob noted, was a number of ideas in his head when he arrived. I found some of our earliest emails recently, and as you said, Rob, he was interested in writing about trails and about the Appalachian Trail, but not about walking the Appalachian Trail. This is we'll hear it from Rob, having to steer people's expectations with a book like this. But I've learned, I got to know Rob while he was here, but I got to understand how Rob was thinking the whole time when I read the book. And it finally added an extra dimension of thoughtfulness and intent that was super satisfying, because conversations are one thing, but then to see the result of some really good, deep thinking is another. So anyway, a lot of people are proud of Rob. I was with some of them this weekend in outside Middlebury at a reunion of the Middlebury Environmental Fellows program. Rob had one of those, and I taught a class of them, and I got to hear him do a reading, which I'm afraid is not on the menu tonight, though maybe we can convince you at the end. It was really, really great, and we were just 5 miles from the Long Trail up there, so it seems appropriate. Can you tell everybody about your intellectual journey while you were here? Because I think something happened while you were here.
Yeah.
I hope.
So yeah, the kind of, the creation myth of this book that I tell in all the radio interviews and everything is that I was hiking the Appalachian Trail, and while I was hiking it, I became obsessed with trails. And that's true, that's half true. But the truth, the full truth is that I did start noticing other kinds of trails and thinking about the metaphor of the path and stuff, but that was not the book I intended to write. The book I intended to write was, I had this idea that there's only one book anyone has ever read about the Appalachian Trail, and that's A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson. And that's a very specific kind of book. It's very humorous. He didn't really hike the whole trail or even anything close to the whole trail. And he didn't even really capture the essence of what through hiking is. And some of the, because he's a humorist, he wasn't willing to get kind of earnest and philosophical in the ways that I embarrassingly often am. And so I wanted to write a book about, to capture those things, a little bit more of a literary, more thoughtful, more ruminative story about hiking the Appalachian Trail, and I applied to the program with that, and everyone was sort of encouraging but not overwhelmingly enthusiastic about it, was the way I would describe it. They're like, yeah, I think that'll work, and and of course I was like, no, it will work. I'm going to, like I said, 9 states, and I'll have 9 chapters, and it'll all be done in 2 years. And it was ridiculous. It was because, of course, writing a book is so much more of a, unpredictable journey than that. And so I kept chipping away at the book while I was here, and I would do pieces here and there that were tangentially related to it. And as I did, I just noticed, to stick with the trail metaphor, just all these other trails going off in all these many directions that had nothing to do with the Appalachian Trail. They were actually more interesting than my original idea. And so the way I always describe it is I had this other file on my computer. I had, one for the Appalachian Trail, and this other one just called like trails stuff or whatever. And I would throw clips in there whenever I would be reading, because I'd be reading something and I'd find something fascinating about, E.O. Wilson discovering the nature of pheromone trails or whatever it may be, and I'd throw it in there. And I realized one day that I had so much stuff in this other file that it was really more than that was in the Appalachian Trail file. And I was actually going to a meeting with Rob one day to talk about my thesis, and it just congealed. The way I was described it is it was like an iceberg flipping over. Suddenly I realized that I had the whole idea upside down. And if I wrote a book about trails, these sort of single topic books that they have now, about roads or whatever it may be, and that may have actually also been, I didn't even think about that till just now, but I may have just been ripping off your
Only
thing.
just now, Rob.
I knew they were similar, but because you were just publishing that then at that point, so that anyway, now I realize it's much more obvious. But yeah, so I realized that this idea, and then of course the first thing you do is you go on the internet and you Google like crazy and you see if anyone else has written your book, and you just pray to God no one had. And in this case, no one had written. People had written books about roads. Ted's book had just come out. I think there was a much older book called On Roads. And I had wanted to, I immediately had the title, I had the whole thing in my head. It's going to be called On Trails. It's going to be this book about trails. The structure, it all came to me like in the time between where I walked from my apartment to Rob's office. And by the time I got into Rob's office, I had it all straight. And not only did I know I would write one book, I knew I'd write a trilogy. This is the way my brain works, unfortunately. And so I came into Rob's office and I was all excited, and I said, I've got this idea and I think it's going to work. And I started describing to him this experience I'd had when I was in Tanzania. I was hiking with these Maasai tribesmen in Tanzania, and we've been following elephant trails. And I'd stopped and thought, there were 2 things that happened on that trip. One is I stopped to just wonder about how elephants always find the lowest pass through the mountains and the shallowest ford across a river. How do they do that? It was incredible to me because their trails were so elegant. And the other thing is that I was, when you're hiking in a culture that does not have backpacking, which of course is a very modern, very Western thing, there's often a lot of absurdity because the logics are sort of are different. And so one of the things I remember the Maasai telling me is that they have a word for white people. They have a lot of words for white people that are quite funny. One of them is sexless turtles, because they have these big backpacks, and they think the boys and the girls look the same because they dress similar. So that's one. But the one that they told me was, it was something like people with heavy luggage looking for problems, because they would see these people going, and there would be a big mountain, and there would be a trail going around to the left and a trail going around to the right, and they would go straight up the hardest way possible. And they just thought it was like the funniest thing. And so I remember, and I was just putting on like, man, there's something really fundamental there about the way that we find our way across landscapes, the way we stitch our worlds together, both geographically and metaphorically and metaphysically. I could feel it. There was an electricity there. And so by the time I sat down, I said that to Rob, and he said something like, I always liked this idea, but this is the first time I've really been interested in this idea. Like you're onto something now. And so I knew walking out of it, I will not, I don't know what I'll be able to get done while I'm here, but I'll get something done. And what I did basically is, rather than working on one piece, I don't know how the program is structured now, but I basically wrote this big sprawling, weird skeletal thing, which was, I didn't know at the time, but it was basically a book outline. Because it was following, from insect trails and game trails, and then my hike and, these bigger trails. And so that actually became the structure later when I, through a sort of serendipitous number of meetings, including the Middlebury Environmental Journalism Fellowship, got myself an agent. I had the bones of a book proposal ready to go. And so I got the book deal like very, very quickly after meeting my agent, because it was all ready. Which is, if I can impart one piece of advice, that's what it would be, is have everything ready to go when, because it's like you just bang your head against a wall in this industry trying to get a chance, and then your chance will come, and you got to take it really fast, because it just, otherwise it'll breeze you right by, so.
Okay, so there's some of the origin story of the book. I find when I'm listening to an author talk about a book I haven't read, I want to know the shape of the book, like what happens in this book. And so I'm just going to tell you very quickly, Rob's book has a prologue, which considers his time on the Appalachian Trail, but then all kinds of other things, including how his life has been involved with academia and then not, and then back to academia and then not. And it's some of those times when he's not, but when he's instead outdoors, especially hiking, doing other things that he has felt most himself. And so that resonated with me. A lot of my books have come in those spaces between academia and not as well. And then there's chapters 1 through 6, which I imagine bear a resemblance to what you were thinking at the start. Fossil trails at the very beginning, then little animals like ants and the pheromone trails, larger animals by chapter 3, especially elephants, and then some sheep with the Navajos. Rob goes to all these places and helps, he tried to help herd some sheep. I guess it's harder than it looks. And then back into history, the idea of trails morphing into roads. And then what you read up in Vermont was from the epilogue, right?
Yeah, that's right.
About this old guy who Rob had to pursue him over some months.
Years. It was years, yeah.
To get permission to walk with him. He's not crazy, but he's eccentric.
People always reach for that word. Yeah,
You do.
He's not crazy, but he's complicated. He's very complex. Basically, it's this guy named M.J. Everhart. His trail name is Nimblewill Nomad, and he's this guy who, in his 60s, he gave away all of his possessions and just started walking. It's a kind of run Forrest run type of deal. And he never stopped. He's been walking ever since, and he has done every major long-distance trail in the United States. He's sort of run out of trails, and now he's doing he's walking highways. He has this very peculiar way of walking, which is he keeps his backpack very, very light, and he walks from, he tries to get to a town or a restaurant or whatever as quickly as possible. And then in the winters, he lives out of his pickup truck, and he'll drive from Walmart parking lot to Walmart parking lot, and he goes to McDonald's because that's where they have Wi-Fi. So he's this sort of wandering spirit, and I thought, this guy he's just so interesting. I want to interview him for my book. So I wrote to him, and he wrote me back very angry and said, I would never talk to you. You are a pinko, lefty, environmental so-and-so. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it was basically that. And he's, and then we got in this back and forth, and I said, first of all, where are you getting that from? I'd written a piece for On Earth magazine, and so he had taken that, and it was, and so, okay, fair enough. I am a pinko, lefty, commie, green, whatever. But I was like, how do you know? And then also, I said, how are you not that? Also, you're the person, you're a perpetual hiker. You spend all your time outdoors. You live in national parks. You walk on national highways. I'm so curious about your thinking. And he's just said, And I said, I don't think this piece will be a political piece. And he said, well, if you think that something, preserving the wilderness isn't a political issue, then I don't even know where to start with you. And we got back and forth for months, and he would ignore me, and I'd write to him again. And I finally said, man, I'm not going to leave you alone. Like, normally I would respect your privacy and your wishes to not be interviewed, but you're too interesting. Like, I have to interview you. And so it was years. It was because I remember writing to him when I was an intern at Men's Journal, and then years later he wrote back to me finally and said, and I think it was when I was at the Middlebury Fellowship, he said, okay, you can interview me, like, just because he had all these long emails. He said, but I'm going to be walking down this stretch of highway on this day in the middle of the summer in Texas, and if you can find me, you can walk with me and you can interview me. I said, okay, and I did it. I flew down to Houston. My sister lives in Houston. I went and found him, and we drove down the side of the road, and there he was on the side of the road, and I got out and I shook his hand. He said, Rob? I said, Nibblewell, and all right, you found me. And so, I gave him some ice cream and tried to, and we spent 3 days walking together and just arguing and talking philosophy and about his life, and he's just an incredibly complicated, fascinating guy. It was a tough piece structurally for the book to get into sort of craft thing. My editor, John Cox, is here. He's a brilliant human being. You should all pitch him your book ideas and harass him.
That's where I was going to go next, is to figure out how John, because I know you guys had a lot of back and forth, and I imagine it was over the shape of the book.
It was. The shape is pretty much intact from what I envisioned, but it was the hard part I found were the margins. It's a start and the end. And in the beginning, the prologue was tough because you have to sort of introduce your reader to your voice and your sensibility, give them some sense of your life. But I didn't want to just write like a straight ahead prologue. I wanted it to be a little bit more wandering and weird than that. And originally the prologue I submitted, I think, was way too wandering and weird. And also I'm kind of a weirdly private person, and so I didn't want to put too much of myself in there. And then it was actually a friend, Sandra Allen, some people here know, who said, you got to put more of yourself. I mean, people are going to stick with you for 300 pages. They got to know who you are. And so I put a little bit of my backstory and my childhood and the ways that, how being gay, for example, has influenced my feelings about the wilderness, right? And it's something that, I wouldn't have normally felt was relevant to a book about trails where I'm not really in most of it. But I think it does influence it in these kind of subtle ways. And so that was hard. And then the epilogue is especially hard because you got to wrap everything up. And, John pushed me, and he may be right in hindsight, I don't know, but John pushed me to have Nibblewell Nomad be his own chapter at the end. And it is a very long epilogue. It's like, remember how 18,000 words or something? I mean, it's very long the way I submitted it. Right, exactly. John thought it should be chapter 7, which has a nice ring to it. But I was insistent that it's not a trail. It's whatever. I had my reasons. But yeah, and then the epilogue became this way to get into the larger question of your path through life. The metaphor of what path do you take through life, and that's something that Nibblewell Nomad thinks about a lot. And he's taken a very extreme path in his life, and so I thought it was an interesting encapsulation of that. But it is an unusual way to write an epilogue, I think, to have it be so narrative and so involved. And I don't know. I mean, I haven't gotten very much feedback from reviewers about if they liked it or if they didn't, if they think that narrative works there.
So the structure proceeds from old and simple trails, like fossil trails in Newfoundland, to a present-day guy walking on a highway.
Yeah. And the International Appalachian Trail, right? So the most vast and postmodern trail that I could find, which is they extended the Appalachian Trail up through Canada, then they went up to the northern tip of Newfoundland, and then they extended across the Atlantic to Greenland, Iceland, all the way down through Western Europe to Morocco. So it's 12,000 miles. When I hiked the Appalachian Trail, it was 2,000 miles, and it took me 5 months. So you can imagine how long 12,000 miles would take you, and you can't even walk it. It's not contiguous. But the idea is it reconnects the Appalachian geology that existed when there was a Pangea. So it's split along that seam, and you can follow the geology. So that's actually what I was writing for Middlebury, was trying to trace that trail and just get in the head. And it was just one guy in Maine who had this wacky idea. I said, well, just the mountains keep going. Why do we stop at the border?
Yeah.
And he's been doing it ever since, and it just keeps growing and growing and growing.
What I was getting at is each chapter, even the simple, the chapter about simple things like fossils has different parts. Part of it's in Newfoundland, part of it's with a scientist somewhere else. Scientists are often your guides, but what connects it all besides the theme is your presence as a narrator. And you just talked about something I wanted to ask about, which was finding your I. I'm teaching a course this semester to a couple of people in the room about exactly that. And we had a guest last night who's writing a memoir and whose editor had said, "We need more of you in here." Yeah. A memoir? But there are ways to write using the I that don't dig deep into your intimate life or your core self. Was finding an I that worked for you a struggle? Did your editor say, "We need more of you," or no? I
don't know, John. Did you say that? I don't think he said we need more of you. In the rest of, I don't know. Maybe. Yeah, up front it was, and then I think it's more about. I think you need to differentiate between, your voice, like your sort of the lens that you're using, and then what you're pointing that lens at, right? So like the style in which you're writing it, and then sort of your outlook, the way what you're going to include, what you're not going to include, and then if you're going to turn that camera around and point it at yourself, and for how much of it. If you think of it as a documentary, right? Like Michael Moore is someone who points the camera at his own face a lot. Right. And I did not want to be pointing the camera at my own face a lot because I was 28 years old and I didn't know anything. So who cares what I think? It was not about me. I wanted to find some experts who've thought deeply about it. So that was one of the structuring, the nice little structuring devices I had, which I didn't totally stick to, but I want to find someone who's obsessed with trails in some way and find them through them. So it's, more of a journalistic approach, but then the voice is not very journalistic. It's more of a sort of, I was trying for more of a kind of Bruce Chatwin-y kind of wandering thing.
Right. He never reveals too much about himself, but he's very present.
But he has a very, that's interesting. Yeah, so Chatwin reveals, he revealed very little of himself, and yet he had a very particular lens, right? And he had a very particular voice. And so Chatwin, even if he's not pointing the camera at himself. So that's what I was going for. I'm not certain I pulled it off, but I was trying to have a particular voice, and also to have the voice, especially the style of the book, echo the subject matter, right? So if it's a book about linearity, it's a book about elegance, it's a book about streamlining. So I kept just trying to smooth the prose so that it was as slippery. You know that scene in The Aviator where Leonardo DiCaprio was like, it needs to be slippery. He's running his hands and he's like, no, there's these little rivets. Like I was like that, and I actually watched it. I watched that movie with my in-laws, my boyfriend's parents, when we were staying at his house, and that movie came on, and I made his parents watch it so I could get to that scene, and they were so bored, like they were totally not into it. I was like, no, this science really cool, because it was. I felt that way, like it just you had to keep going until it got to that point where the reader wouldn't even notice it, really, hopefully, but it would sort of resonate.
So I may be wrong about the chapter. I think it's chapter 2 where Remy appears, and it's a sort of declaration of your relationship. But that's not what it's about. It's about getting lost. Yeah. Which you guys did on a hike
in our backyard. Yeah.
Yeah. Near not in Vancouver.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's in
British
BC.
Columbia. Yeah, BC.
And I think I saw that it was serial somewhere, right? Didn't some
in the New Yorker? Yeah, in NewYorker.com. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's a great story. Could you tell everybody what happens?
Yeah. So it is kind of a weird segue within that chapter, because the chapter is about insect trails, pheromone trails, how ants and tent caterpillars, how they create these incredibly efficient trails using chemicals. But one of the things that will happen with insects, any insect really that follows pheromone trails, is sometimes they get caught in a feedback loop, and they will literally form circles. And with ants, they're called ant mills. But if any of you have ever read Fabre, my French is terrible, whatever, the French entomologist, he writes about it happening with tent caterpillars too, famously. They will get trapped on the top of a vase and they'll walk in circle for like 7 days, is what he describes. So I was thinking about that, and I thought we'd had this, there's this, many, many stories about walkers getting lost in the woods and walking in circles, right? If you have no point of reference, you'll get out there and you'll just walk in circles endlessly. Turns out that's not entirely true. When I finally interviewed a scientist, a guy named Jan Suman had done a study. He put GPS on a bunch of people, sent them off into the woods with no direction. It was a cloudy day. They had no way of orienting. They don't really walk in circles. They walk in like squiggles, like random squiggles, like a child would draw, before they can draw. And what happens is at some point your trail circles back on itself. You see something you recognize and you freak out because you think I'm walking in circles. And there's some like deep existential horror about that. So I was trying to capture the deep existential horror of that. And so my boyfriend and I live in British Columbia and out on the edge of a provincial forest called Smuggler Cove. And we can walk through the forest to get to the Salish Sea, and we'll go fishing and stuff. And so when we first arrived there, our neighbors are all kind of like spooked by the forest. They live on the edge of the forest, and there's cougars back there, so they don't let their kids play back there, and there's bears and stuff. And one of our neighbors, our next door neighbor, Johnny, said, don't go back there, around sunset, or like you'll get lost. Like people get lost back there. There's something, it spooks them. They get
Bermuda Triangle.
Yeah, it's like they get bewildered back there. And my other neighbor had said he got lost with his daughter. He's actually very mad that I mentioned that in the book, because he's like, now I'm immortalized as the guy who got lost with my daughter. But anyway, so we went back there one day, and we ended up, we walked through the forest, and we got to this place where there was a fork in the road, and we were trying to orient ourselves. So Remy leaned a stick up against a tree, and then we took the right fork. We went along and we walked, and
You left that as a breadcrumb, basically?
basically, yeah, just so that like we would know, we would mark that place. And we walked around, and then we found ourselves back at the tree with the stick leaned up against it. I was like, what the hell? And so we turned around and went the other way. And we walked around, and we found ourselves back again at the tree with the stick on it. And we're like, what is, and so we're walking in circles in this forest, and it's kind of getting darker. We're starting to get freaked out. And we start to kind of like, well, we know the water's that way, so we cut off through the underbrush, and of course that's much more difficult. And we're just getting things scratching our face. And we go back to the trail and we walk around. And finally, we realized that there were two trees, and someone else had leaned another stick up against a tree in exactly the same way. And so we'd been walking back and forth between the 2 points, thinking we were walking in circles. And Remy kicks the stick into the woods, and the world sort of rights itself, and we figure out how to get out. And of course, now it's so funny because I've walked that trail dozens and dozens of times. Every Sunday we'll go out there and we'll go swimming and fishing and stuff. And I can't imagine how I got lost, but there's something about a place when you're there for the first time, you have no waymarks. That's just, it's your world spins around.
So Saturday, I think you were probably part of this group that took a hike from, you weren't there. All these outdoorsy environmental fellows took a hike along a little piece of the long trail to a lake. And it's a really cool lake. You could swim there. There are giant leeches by the shore, but you could get past them. And I remembered that a couple years ago, on this very familiar trail, I was hiking with my wife and got lost. And I'd done it many times and got lost. And I'm good at not getting lost, but I got lost. And I was reading this summer, was it in the spring, the story about the woman who stepped off the Appalachian Trail and died. Yeah. She got lost. But
Geraldine Largay was her name, but she was not good at orienting herself.
She was not good at that.
And she didn't have a map, and she was not very well prepared. But she'd been hiking the trail for all that time. I mean, she was an experienced hiker, but she didn't have the means to get back out when she got lost.
On trails, you link getting lost with the idea of maps and also the changing nature of trails. And I think there were some trails in Morocco. You just knew if you went there, you were likely to get lost because they were everywhere, right?
Yeah.
They were not marked.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, it was goat paths.
Yeah.
The Berbers follow these goat paths, and they're on the maps with these little, tiny, spidery little lines. And yeah, I just knew if I went there without a guide, I would be this blundering fool, just getting lost and wasting a lot of time. So I hired an amazing guide named Latifa Asalouf, who's one of the only two female Berber hiking guides in all of Morocco, and she was fantastic.
As human beings, I think we connect extra well with the human beings on trails, and such as the guy in the epilogue, but also it sounds like the through hikers on the Appalachian Trail are a sort of subgroup of humanity that
Subhumans.
no, not subhuman, but they sound endlessly eccentric and colorful. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, partially it attracts eccentric people. There were some very eccentric people starting out, actually, who didn't end up getting very far because they were so eccentric. One guy only walked at night. One guy carried a crossbow. He was like, I'm not going to carry any food. I'm just going to have this crossbow. I'm going to hunt squirrels along the way. And I never met him, but he was a couple of miles ahead of me. And it was so funny because I learned about him because there would be like a couple of crossbow darts like at every shelter that he was leaving behind. So he was like, the way I envisioned it, he's like, okay, I need the crossbow, and I need like 10 crossbow darts, but I don't need 15 crossbow darts. And so he'd leave 5 behind. And then next shelter, okay, I need the crossbow, I need 5 crossbow darts, but I don't need, so I'd leave 5 more behind. And then okay, and then there's like 4 more. I need the crossbow, I need 1 crossbow dart, but I don't need. And then he finally was like, fuck it, and he left all of them. And so you'd see these little breadcrumb of all these shed items of these people, because everyone goes out in there and they think they're going to reinvent the wheel. You know, they're like, I don't need this. I'm going to only eat protein bars. One guy was only eating protein bars. And of course, he just he just felt like shit after like a couple of days. You can't just do that. And so, yeah, there's very eccentric people, but over time, a lot of those people get weeded out. Like, I don't know what the statistics is, but like 75% of people don't make it the whole way. But what happens is you form these groups, and it's a kind of subculture that forms, and there's all these traditions. And I don't even know how the traditions, I often thought about that, like how they get to you, because it's oftentimes a different group of hikers, but somehow just through osmosis, like you're supposed to all have trail names. So everyone gives themselves a trail name, they give each other trail names. There's these registers that are at every lean-to, so you write these notes in them, and it's this really cool way of communicating that's very, you can only talk to the people who are behind you, but not ahead of you, and the people ahead of you can talk to you, and then you have this record later.
So your nickname was Spaceman?
Spaceman, yeah.
Somebody gave it to you because of your shiny kit?
Yeah, just like this ultralight gear that I had was all shiny, and yeah.
But there's a great comment in there about how it kind of works on another level, because he felt like an anthropologist or someone who had arrived on Earth,
like an extraterrestrial,
to this bizarre collection of people that you were. You're part of them, but you're also definitely taking notes.
Yeah, that's true. And actually, when I started out, I had a video camera as well, and I was trying to take video while I was hiking, and it was an interesting revelation, because you can't really. I was interviewing people. I thought I would make like a little documentary, and so I would set up the tripod. I remember one of the first ones I did, I set it up as this guy in his 60s, and I set it up, and I said, just talking to the camera, I won't be around, I won't even check it till I get home, just say whatever you want. And I went away, and I came back 7 minutes later, and he was like weeping, and he said, like, she would have been 62 today. And I was like, oh my God, like this got really real. So I stopped doing that, because it felt weird. Like, I was interviewing, like, if I had the camera on, and I'm sure all of you have experienced this in one capacity or another, you're not really a part of the thing. You can either record it or you can live it. And it's very hard to do both at once, especially if you have something like this up to your face. So eventually, also it was really heavy, so it wasn't a hard decision. But I just sent it home. I said, I can't do this. It's taking me out of this experience. I want to fully experience it in a sort of first-person way. I don't want to be recording it. But I do. It's hard to get rid of that, distanced anthropological kind of view of once you've adopted it, yeah.
And do you have any thoughts about people for whom passage on a trail is a very freighted, like Cheryl Strait? That's a pilgrimage, right, to rescue herself, kind of, from all kinds of bad things she had been through, and people bring their sad and traumatic situations to a trail.
Well, they're often looking to shed that baggage, I think, right? They go to a trail, in the same way maybe you'd go to a pilgrimage or something. You're looking to cleanse yourself of certain things, because, in everyday life, it's hard to find the headspace to do that. And you feel like you want to break. You're going to break spatially. You're going to break, from all your friends. You're going to go out there and you're going to shed everything behind. That's something I write about Nimblewill, is that it's this cutting of ties. When you go on a walk, you can't carry a whole lot. So you're shedding a lot of your possessions. You can't be in contact with your friends or your family. Something Thoreau writes about a lot. You have to sort of leave everything behind. And it's this kind of streamlining experience where, you get a little lighter as you walk. I mean, physically and mentally, you can just feel it. And so, I think a lot of people go to these trails looking for something looking to resolve something. Either, it's people in transitional moments. So it's people who just graduated from college. It's people who just got out of the army. There's a lot of people who just gotten out of the military, people who just retired from their jobs, or people who've just gotten divorced. I would say are like, at least like 50 to 75% of the people I met were in one of those transitional periods. And part of it's just practical because you don't have time. If you're in the middle of a job, you can't just take 6 months off to go walk. But also, walking is a really good way to spend time and meditate on those things. And I didn't have that really. That's one of the things I fess up to in the book is like, I think, it would be a lot easier to sell this book to people if I was addicted to heroin and I had, because the people love that narrative. It's a really great, easy thing to explain to people. Like I had all this internal turmoil and I needed to, whereas, I was doing okay when I started and I was doing okay when I finished. And, it was a great time to think and to have a lot of revelations, but it wasn't really a cleansing or something.
But I'm sure you'll be explaining that for a long time. This was not that for you, but you talk about how people in other countries walk for other reasons, and right, trails have different meanings everywhere.
Yeah,
I don't want to monopolize all the time with Rob. I bet there are questions. Will you take them?
Of course. Yeah.
If you need time to think of one, I could ask another question, but why not? Yeah, let's start.
So we have an extra mic?
Yes, there's a mic coming.
Oh.
And this will make sure it's part of the recording, right?
Okay, yeah. I just wanted, because you mentioned that you specifically wanted to do more, instead of like the humorous perspective, you want to do more almost philosophical. I wanted to know how exactly you were able to kind of blend in these very lofty ideas to kind of not alienate the reader, because like you'll kind of just casually throw out like Freud's uncanny, and whether, I don't know if your editor specifically was like maybe you should make it more accessible, or how you kind of weave that in.
Yeah, no, that is one of the hardest. And if you read my Amazon reviews, which you never do, but I did, some people do take me to task for that, because it's definitely a hard question, because on the one hand, that's some of my favorite writing, is writing that's willing to engage deeply with ideas and to assume a certain level of literacy and familiarity, not necessarily to like name drop, the uncanny or whatever, with the assumption that the reader knows, but just to assume that the reader is willing to go there with you if you're going to take them there. And so I did make that assumption. I tried to make things as accessible as possible without making them too like pop philosophy, but that's a really tough question of when to be willing to delve into those things and when not to. I don't know if we even had a rule for how to calibrate it, what to trim. I mean, we definitely trimmed a lot of stuff that went even deeper into those questions, or were there's a whole thing about Jakob von Uskul, the biosemioticien, Estonian biosemioticien who I'm obsessed with, and that ended up all getting trimmed away. Although John was actually trying to find a place. John probably loves von Uskul even more than I do, and he's trying to find a way to put it back in. So the question of like, is this edifying versus just is this like pretentious nonsense that doesn't need to be in there, is like that's just an instinctive thing that you got to decide for yourself, and it's a risk, right? Like every time you take the reader there, there's a chance the reader's not going to want to go there with you. But if the reader does follow you to all those places, hopefully it's like a richer journey for it.
I'd say only mention an Estonian biosemioticien if you're really, really into it, because that's the only chance you have of readers following you.
No, I'm not going to defend von Uskul to you people, but it's actually quite interesting.
Hey, Rob. I wanted to know, in something that had such a long gestation, if there was a germ of what you had initially that you saw went all the way through that whole process to the end of what ended up being published.
Yeah, there are probably stretches of prose that I wrote here, like in this building even. I mean, there are little pieces. Most of it was transformed, and oftentimes a seed is a really good way to put it, because it would be something. It would be a question. It would be a line or an observation, and then oftentimes you go back, you you think you've got something really good, and then you got to like dig a little deeper to find out if it's even totally true, and you find out it's not fully true, and you have to complicate it. Or I can't think of any specifics off the top of my head in terms of things that made it all the way from the beginning to the end. I mean, I know, like I said, the E.O. Wilson thing was something that I wrote about very early on. You know, E.O. Wilson discovered pheromone trails by taking all the organs out of a fire ant and smearing them across this this like piece of glass, and then finally he got to this thing called the Dufour's gland, and he smeared it out, and all the ants went crazy, and they lined up along the trail, and so he figured out that he could write his name in pheromones. He isolated the trail pheromone. He would write his name, and the ants would line up to spell his name. And I thought that was such a great kind of creepy image of like these just like deterministic trails where the ants can't help themselves, and they're spelling out the name of like their god, you know. And so I found that very early on, and I held on to it all along. But yeah, so there's definitely, I mean, it's an interesting, so it took me 7 years, I guess, to write this book from the moment I walked the trail until the moment I handed in the final draft of the manuscript. And yeah, a lot of it is transformed, but a lot of it's there from the very beginning, yeah.
I've only read the prologue, so forgive me if you address this at length in the book, but I'm curious what you think about people who sort of use trails intermittently, like your casual hiker or even someone who is coming back from the military and like does their pilgrimage on the Appalachian Trail or something, versus people who make their lives of trails. Like you mentioned the Maasai, you mentioned the nomad. Is there a distinction for you? Is it sort of like a gradient of the same trail culture?
I mean, it's definitely, I don't know. I think people who are steeped in trails, for example, trail builders or people who live their lives walking trails, spend a lot more time thinking about it, or maybe just absorb it without even just sort of subconsciously or unconsciously absorb it. And so for this book, it was more interesting to talk to them because, you know, their worlds were sort of shaped by this paradigm, and you could see it, you could find it in all these weird little manifestations of how they thought of the world in terms of trails. But so there is a distinction, but I think that most of us, the metaphor of the trail is so prevalent in most cultures and most religions. You'll find this sense in which you know, the way, for example, you know, comes from weg, which is path. Like there's you know, the Tao, I mean, you've read the prologues, you know, the Sunnah. It's that is a very, very powerful metaphor. So people all have it, just not to a greater, just not to the extent where they maybe consciously spend a lot of time thinking about it. And so I sought out people who are, you know, trail obsessives, but yeah, I think it sort of applies to most people. Yeah.
Hey, so I'm wondering, over a period of 7 years writing it, like I would imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there must have been a time or several times where you just were like, I'm so sick of this, I don't want to think about this topic anymore, like I want to get out of this headspace. So I'm wondering what you did to maybe give yourself a break now and then, if you did that, and what you did to kind of shift the Rubik's Cube and sort of get yourself back into it with a new angle, or sort of like a renewed, like how to renew your interest in it and see in a different way.
Yeah,
without
I mean,
like tired eyes.
That's a really big question for a book. You know, if you're thinking about writing a book, first of all, if you pick a topic that you're even like, you know, you're like half interested in, do not do it, because it's going to take so much longer than you think, and it's going to kill you. Like it will just kill you, because it's just so much harder than you think it is. There's no way you could predict at the outset. You think, well, it's like, you know, in my head I was like, oh, it's like writing like 7 feature articles, you know, like I could do that, but it's not. It's like it's like reading one giant feature article, and when you get to the end, you have to keep all the pieces together in your head, and you change one thing, and everything else changes. And so we got to a point where, you know, to answer your question, first of all, about how I kept it fresh. I was fortunate in the sense that each chapter is different. So I would write, you know, I'd spend 3 months or something writing, like the third chapter took me an entire summer, because it's huge, it's 20,000 words. And then I would hand that in, and then I had this break, and the next chapter was about like ancient, you know, trails, ancient footpaths, and it was a totally different subject. And so I could go and then start, you know, and then what happens is you start reading about one thing, and then you realize you know nothing, and you have to read everything, and you spend months reading, and, you know, so I would totally forget about the animal trails. And then by the time John had edited it, it was kind of fresh to me again. I'd almost forgotten what I'd written, and because that would be months later. So it was actually a really nice process like that. If you can, and I assume all book editors do this, if you can do it on a chapter by chapter basis rather than editing like the whole thing or like half the book, I think the smaller increments you can turn the book in, the easier. But just the larger question of keeping yourself in love with the book is, especially near the end, it's really tough. I mean, there was a period at the end when I had gone, my boyfriend's from Australia, and I had planned to hand the book in by December 1st, go to Australia, stay with him in his parents' house. We were gonna, and like relax, right, and be on the beach. It's Australia. It's like, in December. And then, of course, it's not done. You think it's done, but it's not done. And so we get the edits back, and then I was like, okay, well, it'll be done January 1st. So I'd set myself these like deadlines, and I'd say, I'm going to get it done by January 1st. And I'd work 7 days a week, just like working like a madman. I'd wake up at 7 a.m. and I'd go and pour myself this giant thing of green tea, and I would like disappear into this room, and I'd close the door, and it was like a sewing room for his mom who makes wedding dresses, and she gave me the room, thankfully, and so I would close the door and sit on the floor and just like write like whatever, revising, doing all the things you need to do until, basically until like dinner time. She would pass me like a smoothie through the door, and I would like, and I would drink it, and I'd keep writing, and then we would eat dinner, and I would like have one beer, and I'd watch like 20 minutes of bad Australian television, and then I would like go back to work, and I'd work until midnight. And what it is a lot of this stuff is like you can't believe, because I'd already written, you think the book is done, so you're like, what could you have been doing? But there's so many questions you haven't answered that you sort of put aside and you almost forgotten about, that there's all this other work to do, and then the last leg of the book takes a lot longer than you think it does, right? So there's all these edits, and I mean, John is like a heroic editor for how much effort he put into making sure this thing was perfect. And we would have these phone calls that would last like 4 hours long. Like I'd be calling him, and we would talk, and it would just be about like, yeah, long distance or not. It's on Skype. But I would call him up, and we'd be talking about one sentence, and then it would just spiral and spiral. And suddenly we're talking about the nature of the universe. I mean, it got really deep and big because everything has to hang together. And so, and this is a book that, rightly or wrongly tackles some fairly large questions near the end about wisdom and about how we make our way through life and how we make sense of the world. And so, I'm not a philosopher. So I just wanted to make sure I got things right and did the best I could. So the last stage, and then, so this is something they don't tell you. So then the last stage is called First Pass, where we revert to like the 1930s, and he prints everything out on paper, and then they write on it by hand, and then they fax those, or they don't fax them to you, but they scan them and email them to you, and then you have to write back to those comments. And then there's second pass, right? And so the process is much, much longer than you think it's going to be, and it's all that stuff that makes the book as good as it does. But it's like running a marathon, and I ran the New York Marathon, and the hardest mile, is like mile 20 to 25, and then the last like half a mile is the hardest part. And it's this sort of Zeno's paradox where like you think you're getting to the end and you're not. And so you gotta find something that is very deeply important to you and is endlessly fascinating to you. And this is a topic that like I still am collecting notes. Like I can't help myself. I'm still finding like new things that I want to put in the paperback. Like I'll probably never stop collecting notes on this book. But and preferably something that's also essential to the world, right? That will like do some good and that kind of fire will draw you on if you feel like this will help some community of people or, some one person's life. That's the kind of thing that will pull you through to the end, because then it's not just purely ego driven. It's like, and if you can find that topic, then you'll know you can get through.
I should probably point out that most book editing experiences don't really involve an editor willing to spend 4 hours on the phone over a sentence or two. That's anomalous and fantastic, but hard to find. Or editors who will accept the book piecemeal rather than in rather larger pieces.
Yeah. You want to do it again?
Yeah, most editors want the thirds or the whole thing possibly.
Yeah.
Anyway. Sure.
Hi.
Hey.
About Well, all right, here we go. You're talking about you meet these various people on the trail, army people, people are going through divorce, and you're talking to them, and did you feel like there was connection every time, or did you often feel like you were a tourist and sort of a passive observer listening? Was it hard to get these things out of people? And I guess my second part of the question is, did you build connections from this experience that you still have today? Are there people who you walked with that still walk with you, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, there's two parts to that. The people on the trail, of course, those are people who you form very fast friendships with, and then you're friends with for like forever. I mean, because you see them, first of all, you'll run into them within 3 days. You know everything about each other because you talk. There's nothing else to do but talk, and so you'll tell each other your life stories. You become very fast friends, and then you'll lose them, and then you'll bump into them again 3 months later, and then it's like seeing an old friend, and it's it's an incredible experience. So I definitely still have friends. In fact, one of the characters in the book, one of the things I tried to do as much as possible is have characters reoccur or have characters like introduce me to other characters so I could have like more internal cohesion within the book. And one of the characters is a friend of mine from the trail named Snuggles. Her name was Kelly, but her trail name was Snuggles. And she was, after she left the trail, she went to go work in an elephant sanctuary, taking care of former circus elephants. And so I go, I introduce her in the prologue, and then I go and meet up with her in the elephant sanctuary, and then I refer to her again in the fifth chapter. So those are, that's true, and I'm still, Nimble Nomad writes me emails every once in a while trying to convince me that climate change isn't real. People do, Lamar Marshall, there was a guy named Lamar Marshall so these are people I interviewed for the book, which is a slightly different thing. And I think it's harder to stay in touch with the people that you've interviewed, because especially if they read the book, maybe they like their portrayal, maybe they don't. But I still try to stay in touch. I know Lamar Marshall, who made a map of all the Cherokee trails, all the old pre-colonial Cherokee trails in North Carolina, who's a colorful character. He and I stay in touch. He's very happy to be in a book. Ricky Butch Walker, the deer hunter in Alabama, who is the most colorful character probably in the book. He grew up a kind of hillbilly boy in the foothills of Alabama, and told me that his family tree it should be called a family wreath because it goes apart and it comes back together again. And he's just hilarious. Like he's very self-aware, and so he and I stay in touch. He's now married again for the 6th time. So he's like my Facebook buddy now. I'm in touch with most of the people I interviewed, and all my friends from the Appalachian Trail, definitely, yeah. Just go behind it. You don't have to pass it so far.
Hi. So, is this working? Okay. Hi. I'm in the Lit Rep program, and actually, when I was first deciding whether to come to NYU, the other Rob, actually told me about your book and that you were through hiking the Appalachian Trail and that you wrote about it. I thought, wow, I have to meet this guy. It sounds like a fascinating book. And when I opened up your book, I expected to find like a Bill Bryson type thing, and I was very pleasantly surprised to find something very different. And so, for me, this is very interesting. But I guess when I'm thumbing through it, I can only imagine that you, as not a scientist or not necessarily an anthropologist yourself, were there times when you felt overwhelmed by the research and you're like, I don't know how to make sense of this for a layperson? I can only imagine that I would feel in the same boat. I guess that's my first question. On the second question, on a more practical level, can you go more into the process of finding your agent and the initial stage of your publishing process, because that's interesting to me as well.
Yeah, so in terms of the first question, the answer would be absolutely. I mean, I wasn't even, not only am I not a scientist, I wasn't even good at science in high school. I'm not a math and science person. My brain doesn't really work that way, and I decided rather than allowing that to terrify me, I would use it as a positive. And so I would think, if I don't get this, then my reader won't get this. And so if I can make it understandable to my reader, that is, if I can make it understandable to myself, I can make it understandable to my reader. The danger in that is that you oversimplify, right? Science is so messy once you start getting into it. And so the two things I did was I read as much as I could. I allowed my intellectual insecurity to drive me forward into, and it is like an endless process of where you start reading about just this one area of entomology, and then you realize you know nothing about entomology, so you then read a book about the history of entomology, and then you realize you knew nothing about biology, so you read a history. It just grows and grows and grows. I mean, there are the amount of reading I did, and I've of course forgotten half of it now, so it just was like it sort of went into the book, but it all informs. You feel like you're wasting time at the time, and because you're reading so much and so little of it ends up in the book. But what you're doing, I realized, is you're knowing what not to put in the book, right? You're knowing what mistakes not to make, and that's just as what you don't write is just as important as what you write. And then the other thing I did, I remember reading somewhere that John McPhee, when he was writing that geology, massive geology tome, he would not just have everything fact-checked with the people he was interviewing, but if it was a really thorny passage, he'd actually send it to him, right? Which is not something you usually do as a journalist. You don't give people the ability to read, the chance to read what you're writing about them because they might get offended by your description of their appearance or something. There are a lot of ways that could go awry, but when it came to, for example, the history of, Ediacaran fossils, which are, 565 years old, and a lot of the science is unsettled and changing, and I just said, there's no way I'm going to get this all right, so I sent it to Alex Liu, the professor who had done this research, and he, set me straight in a lot of places, and then you write it again, and you send it again, and he says, yeah, it's a little closer, and you do it again. And so that was the trick I used, and I would recommend that if you're not a scientific journalist. There are pitfalls to it, but in my case, I wanted to make sure I was getting everything right, because it's so hard. The second question the answer is not that interesting, really. What happened was I was fact-checking at New York Magazine, and I had applied for this Middlebury Environmental Journalism Fellowship, which used to exist. It went for about 6 years. They would give you $10,000 to go write one story, whether you published it or not. It was just the money. They just wanted you to write a piece of good environmental journalism. So I went and I got that fellowship. I went and reported this story about the International Appalachian Trail, and I handed it in, and one of my advisors there took a look at it. It was assigned to be 6,000 words, and I handed it in at like 13,000 words. And she said, this doesn't really want to be an article, does it? This wants to be a book. And I said, that's true. And I told her my whole idea of the book, and she said, I'll put you in touch with my agent, send her a proposal, maybe she'll like it, maybe she won't. I sent it to her, she liked it, put together the proposal. It took a couple months, sent it to some editors. It happened very quickly. I got a book deal. So it was just like happenstance. And I think that's a lot of times, that's not always how it happens, but it's oftentimes these weird circuitous routes you take. And so it seems like it happens very quickly, right? But there was like 5 years before that where I was putting the thing together. That's what I was sort of saying about have it ready for when you get your chance. Because it will come through, like your friend will, know, it will just happen. Or you can send it out to a bunch of agents, but most of the people I know, I don't know. How'd you get your agent? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it happens through these routes, through connections and stuff, which is not, it's kind of a dirty secret, but it's true. Like someone will introduce you to someone, and it'll happen. Yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot about that. I am not a writer, and I don't have any questions about that. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I apologize ahead of time. I'm more interested in that little anecdote you told about that study where they kind of blindfolded people and saw if they actually walked
Wait,
in
is that
circles.
Angus?
Yeah.
Oh, hey, man.
How's it going? Max was here, too. He says hello. So my question is, like, when you take somebody and you leave them in the woods and you see how they walk, is there direction? Like, if you were to plot their trajectory, and I'm sorry, I apologize for this, but I'm a scientist. So if you were to plot their trajectory,
Yeah.
and like you followed it, would it
Yeah.
be clustered around where they started?
Yeah.
Or would it go directionally and just by chance they would kind of map back?
It's basically just a random walk. So it's like the way the guy described it to me is that there's a lot of noise in the in your navigation abilities. So it's almost like when you're drunk and you're trying to ride a bicycle.
Right.
Yeah. So there's no correlation. Like sometimes they go kind of like this.
Yeah.
And then sometimes they'll go around in the same place. I mean, there's not one.
So there's no directionality to it.
Not if you have no directional cues. No, there's like not really any. No, in fact, they tell you will not get more than, what do I say in the book, 200 yards, 100 yards in any one direction. You'll just end up randomly squiggling Yeah, which is a horrifying thought.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Anybody else? I don't know. He hasn't written to me about it. I don't know. I would be very curious to see. You're right. I should check in with him, because he was the one I was most nervous and remained most nervous. So yeah, I like to see. I did fact check it all with him, but I'm not sure he's read the book itself. Yeah.
Hi there. I had a question for when you were first in proposing this idea, and a lot of people didn't get it right away, especially your superiors and professors. What advice would you have, or how did you protect it? Like when someone, if you tell them your idea and then they're like, what was like your mechanism of like,
yeah,
I'm gonna do it anyway?
That's a tough one, because I didn't do it anyway, right? Like I could have written the book about the Appalachian Trail as a American pilgrimage, and I didn't write that book because I didn't get positive enough feedback from people. But I think if I had a really strong sense that I could do it, I could pull it off, and this will be amazing, because I'm sure there are countless books which nobody has gotten until you write it, and then they see it and they get it. And if you have a strong enough sense of that within yourself, then just ignore it. I mean, I don't know, because I didn't do it. Because for me, like I was sort of on the fence anyway. I'm like, I think this is a good idea, but I'm not sure. And then I was reading other people's reactions. The other thing you have to remember is that writing a good book is not the same as selling a good book. And this is a really hard thing for writers to swallow, but the experience of marketing a book is very different. It's about sort of a capsule description of the book, the cover, and your backstory as a writer. That's what they're going to go to radio stations with. That's what they're going to go when they're publicizing the book. It's unless you can, I don't know, win a bunch of awards for the quality of your prose or something. In that early stage, even just selling the book proposal, you have to be able to boil it down to this thing that clicks with people quickly, this sort of elevator pitch thing. And that is not always a great thing, right? Because a lot of great art cannot be boiled down. But it's just a harsh reality of the world of book publishing. It has to be good on multiple levels. It has to be good as a book, and it has to be good as a 100-word description of a book, which is really, really tough to do. And I think my book's pretty hard to summarize. We had a lot of trouble, figuring that out. And what we ultimately settled upon is that it's easiest when you have some sort of personal way to some personal entry point, right? So when I go on radio interviews, I've noticed they always start with, in 2009, Robert Moor went and hiked the Appalachian Trail. And so it's the Appalachian Trails that people know. The hiking the Appalachian Trail is kind of romantic, and it's a built-in narrative. And then from there, you've hooked the reader enough to where then you can start saying, think about all these other crazy things. Whereas you just said, this guy wrote this book about all these different kinds of trails, people would be like, I don't care about that. That's too, whatever. It's because it's too much. You just gotta have some really easy hook, and it's not a, I don't know, it's not a totally satisfying thing. It's not a great, it's for artistically, it's tough, but commercially, you got to have it. So I don't know, if you have a thing that you think not only is a story that you think that you can tell really well and is worth telling, but also that you can sell, and no one else around you can see it, but that, then fuck them, do it. Yeah.
So maybe one more question and we can retire. Does that sound right, Rob?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you're working on a project like this and it's super long, it took you 7 years, how do you avoid fatigue? And what are some of the tricks that you use for that?
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of trying to get at that. I don't know. I mean, I guess the other tricks I would say, aside from having discrete parts that you can work on separately, so that you can take a break from one part and go work on another part, is just take breaks to go read and re-inspire yourself. I mean, I had a couple of books that I kept by my desk that I would wake up in the morning before I'd even write. I would sit, James Salter's Light Years was one of them, because I love the prose, and I would just sit and I'd read a couple paragraphs just to kind of get my brain firing, and just to remind you that that can be done, like that there are, like, to reach a little higher, someone can, that someone is, you can always make it a little better, basically. And I think that kind of aspirational spirit will keep you like with like the right amount of self-hatred, like not too much to where it's crippling, but then like not too much to where you get sort of self-satisfied. Yeah, just keep reading things that are are better than yourself, and then that will spur you forward, I guess.
That's good advice. Thanks.